This week we're focused on the role played by the media in presenting and forwarding claims about social problems. The importance of the media is probably something that comes as no surprise to you. Although, as Best points out, that role is a little bit more complex than you may think. Let's first start out by understanding what we mean by the term the media. Dictionary definitions of this word vary widely, as it's used in many different fields. The definition that best meets our needs here is the one that refers to the media as a go-between or a means of transmission, specifically the transmission of information or entertainment. When we think about the media, we usually think only about the news media. But as Best points out, the entertainment media is an increasingly important source of information about social problems claims. In fact, in many cases, it's hard to distinguish between the news media and the entertainment media. The Daily Show, for example, is aired on Comedy Central, although it states that its role is to look at today's headlines through a reality-shaped lens. Shock jocks like Joe Rogan, who actually got his start doing stand-up comedy, are almost exclusively concerned with news, as are daytime talk shows such as Tyra Banks, Dr. Phil, The View, etc. I thought it was interesting that Best refers to these kinds of media as secondary claims makers. This kind of elevates their role a bit, and it suggests that they don't just report claims, but they transform them as well. We'll get into this issue of transformation in a few minutes. Let's start out, though, by talking about what we traditionally mean by the news media. Okay, so the news media includes broadcast television news, cable news broadcasts, and both of these can cover local or national news, or some cover both, and newspapers, which also cover both local and national news. There are also various news magazines. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these, like Time and Newsweek, but also general interest magazines such as The Economist, The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, or Harper's Magazine. So each of these news arenas face different constraints on their ability to deliver content. Best describes many of these constraints. For example, all face deadlines. If an event relevant to a particular social problem occurs after a news deadline, then it won't receive immediate coverage in a print genre until the next news cycle. That's less the case with television news, which can easily send a reporter and a camera crew out to cover an event. So let's take an example of this. Suppose that there's a horrific school shooting. Again, broadcast news can preempt other stories in real time and send a camera crew out, as I said, and a reporter to the scene to capture the story. Newspapers, on the other hand, have to wait until the next news cycle to provide coverage. This is a constraint, but also an opportunity, because it means that the coverage that they provide will be more in-depth and perhaps more likely to include interviews with people who are experts on the subject of the news story. And these experts, of course, in many cases, will be the dominant claims makers who have primary ownership, remember that term, primary ownership, of the social problem. Best gets back into this notion of primary ownership later in the chapter, and we'll get to it too in this little talk. Okay. So news producers also face time and space constraints. Broadcast news outlets have about 22 minutes to deliver the news. Local news, of course, sometimes will run longer than that. Print sources operate within page limitations. So to deal with these constraints, editors have to select stories that they believe are of the greatest importance to the communities that they serve. On the other hand, cable news and online news producers face the opposite problem. They operate 24/7 and have lots of space to fill. Still, to avoid losing their audiences, they need to find stories that will hold audience attention. Before we talk about the qualities that such stories share, let's talk a little bit about the audiences for news, because they're important. As Best points out, audiences for news especially national, international news, tend to be better educated, tend to have white-collar professional careers, and higher incomes than the general population. The news that gets reported then is primarily that which news workers believe will be of interest to this group. The tendency to pursue such stories is compounded by the fact that news workers are themselves members of the professional class. Moreover, they tend to live in coastal cities such as New York or Los Angeles, where large media organizations are located, or in Washington, D.C., where, of course, that's the seat of the federal government, and national news, policy-related, congressional, political news, all originates, or much of it originates in D.C. Because of this, claims about the efforts of an employer to stymie unionization effort in Arkansas, or a story about contaminated water in West Virginia, are unlikely to show up on their radars. And if they do show up, in all likelihood, news workers would judge them to be of little interest to their viewers. They wouldn't get aired. Okay, so how do news workers tell stories about social problems in ways that will engage their audiences? Well, again, this depends in part on the arena in which the news is presented. Television news, for example, favors stories that can be told visually and that include moving images. Think about a school shooting again. School shootings are made for television events, which unfortunately may in fact be one of the things that motivates school shooters. But what do they feature? They feature upset children, hysterical parents, police and ambulance crews with their attendant sirens and flashing lights and whatnot. They're all highly imageable. They grab and hold viewers' attention. Moreover, they seem to occur most often in white middle-class communities, similar to those inhabited by news audiences. Compare the imageability of a school shooting to a problem like contaminated water, which probably injures more children than school shootings do in the United States. But what can the camera show? Contamination is largely invisible. It often occurs in places that are distant from centers of news production, and it impacts people who may have little in common with news workers and their audiences. So given all of this, then, is it any wonder that claims about issues like these don't get much coverage? Climate change provides another great example. Until recently, it was difficult for news workers to make the problem appear real to their audiences. Climate scientists have known about global warming since the early 1960s, but the issue didn't start receiving media attention until NASA scientist by the name of James Hansen offered testimony about it before a Senate committee in June of 1988. Now, this kind of coverage, this kind of testimony, is usually very boring and receives very little coverage. But in this instance, the hearings happened to take place during an unusually hot summer in much of the East Coast. Again, the region of the country where a good deal of national news is produced. So the East Coast was experiencing an unprecedented heat wave just exactly on the day that surrounding the days in which Hansen was testifying. So while global warming is not as imageable in the same way as a school shooting would be, the heat wave made climate change real to audiences, and in a way that scientific reports just couldn't do. Another important feature of news production is its reliance on novelty or newness. The same old, as we used to say, will fail to engage audiences and are likely to lead them to tune out. After all, if it isn't new, it isn't news. That said, it is possible to retell the same story from a new angle. And again, we can look at something like climate change for an illustration. While the facts around it haven't changed that much since Hansen's testimony back in 1988, news workers, aided by claims-making groups, have been able to develop a multitude of news story angles. There's an intense hurricane bearing down on the East Coast. Could it be climate change? Fires are raging in Australia. Is this related to climate change? Polar bears are starving due to reductions in sea ice. Again, climate change? A candidate for Senate defeats an incumbent because his strong support for climate change legislation brings out younger voters who see it as a critical issue. Insurance rates skyrocket because insurers anticipate increased losses due to climate change. The list goes on and on. Okay. Attention can also be brought to an issue, novelty, in other words, can be created around an issue, if a celebrity is involved. Paul McCartney, for example, has appeared in the Humane Society anti-cruelty campaign. Michael Jordan supports and has appeared in commercials for Special Olympics. Matthew McConaughey founded an organization dedicated to teen fitness. Matt Damon founded one related to water issues. Now, how many people think that Gary White, who's a civil engineer and had been involved in water issues since the early 1990s, would have appeared on The Daily Show, sitting next to Trevor Noah, without Matt Damon at his side? Probably not many of you. Okay, so I've been talking about the media's role as secondary claims makers, and I've tried to point out how it selects and frames stories about social problems. So just to reiterate, news workers have to be aware of the problem. It has to either be a new story or a story that can be told from a new angle. It has to be a problem that audiences will be interested in. It has to fit within the specific time and space constraints of a particular news genre. And it has to be imageable. Sophisticated claims makers are aware of these and other requirements and build packages specifically designed to meet the needs of media outlets. They stage demonstrations and protests to draw media attention. They schedule events and press conferences in advance and align them with news deadlines. They designate articulate spokespersons, preferably celebrities if possible, who can present their claims and answer questions, and they take steps to ensure that they are presenting claims in such a way that they remain fresh. Claims-making organizations that excel at these tasks often wind up becoming issue owners, a status which reinforces itself over time as news workers seek them out whenever a story related to the issue at hand emerges. All of these considerations are primarily practical in nature. They're things that claims makers and news workers know. You might want to say things they learned in school, things they learned by working in a newsroom for a while. It's important to bear in mind, though, that beyond these practical considerations, the stories news workers relate to their audiences are constrained by the values and worldviews. And by the way, that's both the audience's values and worldviews and the news workers' values and worldviews. This is absolutely critical. News does not simply, it's important to bear this in mind, news does not simply convey information. It tells stories. And these stories, in turn, have to fit within accepted understandings about the world, the way the world works, and also accepted narrative patterns. In other words, accepted patterns for telling stories. In the process, some aspects of a claim are highlighted, while others are pushed aside. For example, the best stories have a clear villain, a vulnerable victim, perhaps a hero, but nonetheless there's a notion of triumph over adversity. If, at a minimum, stories have to leave audiences with a sense that solving the problem is at least possible. Problems that are presented as hopeless will get very little media attention. So Best spends several pages talking about the way in which media claims makers often modify stories to make them fit into the dominant American ideology of individualism and, more specifically, individual responsibility. In communicating claims, Best points this out, is communicating claims about racism, for example, media workers have traditionally portrayed it as an individual failing rather than as a problem baked into American society. Environmental degradation is presented in a similar way, as something caused by an evil corporation and tolerated by corrupt government officials, rather than as a problem intimately tied to the system of profit-maximizing industrial capitalism, which fails to price the cost of pollution into the cost of the goods that it produces. Claims makers that stray from this dominant narrative are marginalized and typically fail to receive attention or access from media gatekeepers. Before concluding, I just want to say that while it's true that media accounts do emphasize stories about villains and victims and heroes, I don't really see this as a bias. Instead, for me, it's a fundamental component of all storytelling. Since the ancient Greeks invented rhetoric or started to describe the nature of stories, stories have to be relatable. They need characters, and they need a plot. And it seems to me that it's impossible to tell a story without these things. C. Wright Mills, the author of The Sociological Imagination, for example, offers an excellent way through which to understand how individual troubles relate to larger social forces, and best points this out. But the sociological imagination does not present a storytelling strategy that claims makers and news workers can use in order to dramatize their accounts of social problems to their audiences. Okay, we're almost done. I left a few things out because I didn't want this to drag on forever. But what I left out was what Best has to say about audience segmentation, the role of the entertainment media, which I touched on just a little bit, social problems, and most important, what he says about social media. The jury's still out, I think, from a sociological perspective about the role of social media in social problems discourses. But I'm going to leave it up to you to tackle those things in the chapter on your own. Okay, there's no blog post for this week, but as usual, there'll be a quiz, and it'll be up and running for you in a couple of days. Hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.